CSW is always a really exciting time for us. It's a rare opportunity for us to be able to connect with women's rights and feminist activists from all over the world. And this year it is definitely a little bit different. This year the pandemic has compelled us to meet virtually, but we're still really grateful for the chance to connect with you all here from wherever in the world you may be zooming in from. We know we have some folks here on the call who are up very late, and we're really grateful for you all for joining us. So I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. So perhaps share your name, your organization, where you're located as we prepare to get started. I will also introduce myself. My name is Diana Duarte, and I am the Director of Policy and Strategic Engagement at MADRE, an international women's human rights organization. And our purpose for gathering you all here today is really summarized in the title of our event, which is that we would like to discuss feminist peacebuilding as a vital pandemic response. We're just over a year since the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 to be a global pandemic. And I know that each of us has seen and felt so deeply how this crisis has transformed our lives and our work. And at MADRE, we partner with grassroots feminist and women-led organizations worldwide that are confronting war and disaster. And we've done that for almost 4 decades. And as the pandemic surged in the past year, we mobilized to strengthen and to deepen our work and to really rally around our partners worldwide. And there were a few realities that immediately confronted us. First of all, it became urgently clear that in communities impacted by war and violence and in post-conflict communities, tackling the pandemic would be a challenge on a totally different scale. How can you socially distance in communities without adequate housing or in refugee camps? How can you provide care for those who may fall ill in places where health systems have collapsed? And some of the speakers that you're about to hear from will address some of those challenges. But it goes beyond that as well. For years, grassroots women and feminist peace builders have honed strategies to defend their communities, to build resilience, and to promote peace. And we saw that many of these same tested and proven solutions would be demanded right now to confront this crisis, not only to end the violence, but also to fully confront the pandemic, to build healthier communities, and to meet people's humanitarian needs. So in this conversation, to sum up, our plan is to dive into the impacts of the pandemic, yes, on women, girls, and communities that have been already affected by war and violence, but also as well to look at the strategies that we can learn from feminist peace builders. So in a moment, I will introduce you to our speakers from Yemen, from the Philippines, and from Colombia, who will share how feminist ceasefire demands and movement building strategies can help us to tackle COVID-19. But before we get into that, I do have a few housekeeping items to share. So first of all, we will be recording the event to capture the discussion. So if you'd like to receive that recording, as well as ongoing updates about our work, please fill out the link that we're going to be posting in the chat in just a moment. It'll be an opportunity for you to share your contact information. And we're hoping to be able to keep in touch and continue this important conversation. As a reminder, we do have Spanish translation available, as well as one of our speakers is going to be addressing us in Spanish. So again, if you click on the button at the bottom of the screen, you can choose either English or Spanish. Also, in a moment, we'll be posting in the chat the safety guidelines that CSW has established, which provide some helpful community guidance to ensure that we're creating a space for healthy and generative discussion. So without any further ado, I'm truly delighted to introduce you briefly to our 3 panelists. We'll be sharing their bios, their full bios later on in the session as they begin their remarks. But first off, we have Muna Luqman, who is the founder and chairperson of Food for Humanity, a humanitarian organization in Yemen. We have Jade Leung, who is the lead convener with Young Women Initiatives, also known as YouWIn in the Philippines. And we have Haidy Duque, who is a founding member and the Psychosocial Projects Coordinator at Vida in Colombia. So to give you a bit of a preview about what you're about to experience, first I will be asking each of our speakers to answer a couple of questions that we've prepared. And after you've heard from each of them, we will then open it up for questions for Q&A and discussion. So please do share your questions in the chat when that time comes. So to begin, I'm honored to turn to our first speaker. Again, Muna Luqman is an activist for women's rights and peace from Yemen and the founder and chairperson of Food for Humanity, a humanitarian organization. She's also the co-founder of the Women's Solidarity Network, the largest network of women activists and human rights defenders in Yemen. And I encourage you to read her full bio, which we'll be including in the chat. So Muna, to turn to you for my first question, can you tell us a little bit about the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the communities that you work with, particularly women and girls? And what are some of the added threats that communities on the front lines of conflict are facing in the context of pandemic?
Well, first of all, thank you, Diana, and thank you, MADRE, for organizing this event. I'm so honored to be here with you, with these great panelists. And also thank you for the attendees for making the time to come to listen to us. When the coronavirus swept around the world, the threat in Yemen is much more overwhelming because there is a deadly conflict and the military escalation persists in Yemen. Millions of innocent people and families have lost their lives. They've been internally displaced. And the humanitarian challenges that it brings are overwhelming. Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. We always hear that, but there's so many underlying issues and challenges and despair in this conflict that have made COVID-19 even double the effect. The ongoing clashes, the militant armies and the militants on the ground, the Houthi rebels and the government-backed forces on the ground, and then the continuous airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition, all of this has put immense stress on the already weak medical services. So combined and coupled with the COVID-19 and also other fatal outbreaks of cholera, of diphtheria, of flash flooding, which has also displaced people and caused numerous amounts of viruses, such as dengue fever. So can you imagine in this kind of setting, the challenges to us as peace builders, to us as volunteers, humanitarians wanted to help the people. On top of that, we have a very weak water system and infrastructure, and today is World Water Day. And it really breaks my heart to think of the people who cannot reach safe water without walking for 2 to 8 hours in very difficult terrain, young girls who are sometimes harassed on the way and sometimes injured. So the hospitals are not responding. COVID-19 has put an extra, all over the world, of course, but in a conflict area such as Yemen, with people who do not have safe water, they do not have the luxury of even owning soap. And they just do not believe in protecting themselves after they've been through so much. People in Yemen have reached a point after so much destruction of civilian infrastructure, the economic crisis, not having salaries for many years, the decline of the private sector, the non-payment of their salaries in the public sector also, loss of livelihoods, lack of fuel, lack of food. They have reached a point when many of them have told me personally that they prefer to die from the airstrikes or COVID-19 because they cannot bear the suffering. We are already seeing massive populations facing starvation in villages such as in Tahama and Taz. This war has to end now before we lose every possible way to end the violence and pandemic. I will stop there, but I do want to say one good news that I just heard that is breaking right now in Yemen, that there has been a Saudi announcement of a ceasefire in Yemen, which would be under the UN auspices. We hope that this holds through. Last year we had something very similar. This year we have a good, stronger leadership and from two envoys, from the US envoy and from the UN envoy, and we hope that it goes through. But it is some sort of light, and I'm happy to announce that in your panel today. So thank you very much. I will stop there.
Thank you for that, Muna. I think it really powerfully speaks to the level of suffering and despair, truly, that people have faced after enduring such a long humanitarian crisis, and the pandemic comes on top of that. We mentioned before that you lead Food for Humanity, a humanitarian organization in Yemen, and you've been working to meet people's most urgent, immediate needs in the context of the war and now the pandemic. Another crucial element of your work, though, is your peace building work, right? The work that you do at the local, national, and international levels to demand peace. And so I wonder if you could share a bit about how women's efforts to build peace relate to and are also a key response to the humanitarian and pandemic crisis.
Well, first of all, yeah, we as Yemeni women peace builders, for instance, we were the first to warn of the crisis and call for a ceasefire to focus the joint efforts on combating the COVID-19 pandemic. Even before the Secretary General, we were the first to call out. We've supported laboratories, hospitals with PCR equipment, and I'm very grateful for MADRE here for providing flexible funding that we were able to use to support hospitals and buy medical equipment, fuel, oxygen. We were also able to train 250 young medics to be the first responders in case of the complete outbreak. Also with our volunteers, we have been able to build water stations to prevent the spread of the virus and other diseases. With the help of ICANN also, we've also been able to provide some aid, but this is all done by the Yemeni women on the ground who are risking their own lives without real funding by the UN pool of funding. We have billions of money coming into Yemen. The Yemeni women are doing all the work at the front lines. They're trying to balance between building peace, silencing the guns, creating social cohesion, but unfortunately only the voices and the sounds of guns are heard and appreciated. Unfortunately, they're the ones who are always at the table. The women are always excluded. The pandemic is really another proof of how the women in the front lines in every community, not just in Yemen, are the ones who are really trying to be there in the critical role of community peace building, community policing, and responding to not just the pandemic, but also other issues that come across with the pandemic, such as hate speech and violence and sexual-based violence also. So the women in Yemen have been, for instance, the Women Solidarity members, they have been negotiating ceasefires, opening humanitarian corridors, participating in water disputes. I myself have been involved in many of the water disputes over land because people are moving within the country because we don't really have a refugee community outside of Yemen, but it's all internally displaced, and this causes a lot of pressure on the resources, and people fight over that. Women are also working on demilitarizing the schools, mediating between the warring parties, and we have also been working a lot on international advocacy to try to push for a ceasefire, a nationwide ceasefire, and a comprehensive, inclusive peace process that does not exclude important players. Because when you exclude these players, they end up picking up arms, and that's when the UN starts listening to them and contributing to violence also. So we are really trying to work on more than one level. It's frustrating, it's underfunded, but we believe in what we do, and I believe that that in each incidents, in each crisis, women peace builders have the experience to really deal with, foster, first of all, social cohesion, and deal with the racism and hatred, and highlight and support the community togetherness, which is so important for preventing violence. Women in Cameroon, Iraq, Pakistan, Liberia, Syria, Uganda, Kenya, everywhere. In Asia, they are working to raise awareness, combat the pandemic, and much more, helping families on the ground. I would like to just conclude that in responding to the pandemic or other crises, we will not be able to achieve that without, for instance, for Yemen, ending the devastating war without delay, terminating the land and sea blockade, and ending the violence by militant groups on the ground, and restoring the state. Because at the end of the day, no amount of humanitarian work, peace building, or money can end the suffering. Only peace can do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Mona. I mean, you made a lot of powerful points, but one that really struck me is this call that you have been so determined and consistent about putting forward over the years around inclusivity, around having people around the table so that they can shape their own futures, and including the question of social cohesion and building those community ties of trust that get so torn apart by war, and we've been so inspired by the work of women peace builders in Yemen to really put the call out for approaches to ending the war where everyone gets a voice. And I think that that's something we can learn from as well as we think about pandemic response, right? How are we building a future, a post-pandemic future where everyone has their needs met and how everyone is, and where everyone is heard. So I think that that's you know, a really important point to draw from all that you just shared. With that, I am excited to turn to our next speaker, Jade. So Jade Leung is a feminist, social activist, and human rights defender, as well as the lead convener with Young Women Initiatives, also known as YouWIn, an organization that educates, organizes, and is dedicated to empowering young women, Indigenous peoples, and LGBTQ+ people in the Philippines. So to turn to you, Jade, with a question, you know, you're operating in a very particular and difficult context in the Philippines right now, where we're seeing a right-wing authoritarian government that has attacked the rights and freedoms of marginalized communities, including women, girls, and the LGBTQ community. So I wanted to ask you, how has a militarized government responded to the pandemic in ways that further curtail human rights? Oh, Jade, I think you're muted. If you could unmute yourself.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. First of all, thank you, MADRE, for this space, and thank you, Diana, for your question. To answer that, well, despite the pandemic, the government responded by passing unnecessary laws that further curtail our rights, specifically the ATL, or the anti-terrorism law, that enables the military to do warrantless arrest and detain activists, human rights defenders, and progressive political groups without due process. It enables and legitimizes impunity and killings without accountability from the government. Last February 24, the Regional Law Enforcement Coordinating Committee Police Regional Office, or the RLECC of the Cordillera, where I belong, passed a resolution allowing the conduct of Oplan Tokhang against left-leaning personalities in the government and media, among other entities. For you guys to know, Oplan Tokhang is used in the government's war on drugs. It is done by knocking on the doors of suspected drug personalities and pleading them to stop dealing and using drugs. This Oplan Tokhang killed 27,000 people from 2016 to present. In our case, in the Cordilleras, the Tokhang style will be used to convince whom the military perceived as left-leaning personalities to return to the folds of the government and dissuade them from further supporting the government's claim of Marxist Maoist inspired rebellion and its known front organizations. Last March 5, Duterte told the police and soldiers to kill and finish off communist rebels in encounters. The Philippine National Police, or the PNP, and the Armed Forces of the Philippines, AFP, mounted a deadly crackdown in Calabarzon on Sunday, last March 7, 2 days after he told them to kill and finish off. The PNP killed 9 activists and arrested 6 activists, all in a matter of hours. What happened in Calabarzon isn't far from not happening in the Cordilleras, given that there is already a resolution to conduct Tokhang on what and who the military and government perceives as left-leaning personalities. This resolution is a manifestation in the locals of the anti-terrorism law, a law once again that is unconstitutional and not needed even without the pandemic. Duterte's new anti-terror law narrows the space for human rights activism, where there is a shrinking space to fight for democracy and increasingly closed space and increasingly closed space for operation of civil society organizations, or CSOs. This is what happens if you become a target in the Duterte regime here in the Philippines. You get red tagged and harassed after. This is how authoritarianism results in normalization of violence in our society. Duterte, the Trump of Asia, just for you guys to have an idea who he is both symbol and substance of what's wrong with the government's pandemic response. Because of the militarized response of the pandemic, they also use excessive force to civilians caught not wearing masks or face shields properly or not wearing any at all. Fines are imposed immediately to those who violate curfew and not wearing of masks. But when it comes to some government officials violating the law, they call for the people to give them compassion. This is compounding the harms that people are already facing because of the pandemic. The military are also arresting vocal citizens critiquing the government's pandemic response in their social medias. They shut down our biggest media company, the ABS-CBN, that provides news and information among its citizens, and lost 11,000 workers from the network, on top of the high unemployment rate because of massive retrenchment due to the pandemic. It is an additional burden and oppression for indigenous women and girls in conflict areas in Mindanao amidst the pandemic, the bombing of indigenous people's schools, and the militarization of their lands and disregard of their human rights. On top of that is the extractive industry and nature of the capitalist and patriarchal society we live in. The lack of disaggregated data jeopardizes the visibility of indigenous peoples in the official data making data collection and development of evidence-based policies represent an even greater challenge without the pandemic. To conclude my answer in this question, allow me to share with you this 2-minute video. Thank you so much.
I will not hesitate my soldiers to shoot you. I will not hesitate. Shoot them dead.
Philippine National Police and the Armed Forces of the Philippines mount a deadly crackdown in Calabarzon on Sunday, March 7. The attacks come 2 days after President Rodrigo Duarte told police and soldiers to kill and finish off communist rebels in encounters.
Thank you for that, Jade. I mean, I think it's a really powerful presentation of everything that you and human rights defenders in the Philippines are up against right now. And it really strikes me that in exactly this moment where what we need is the kind of grassroots organizing that can meet people's needs and bring people together and build stronger communities, that this is a moment where the government is attacking those very leaders who can provide that much needed help for communities. So my next question for you is, what have been some of the impacts of COVID-19 on marginalized communities, including women, girls, and LGBTQ people and indigenous people in the Philippines, as you just began to share, and specifically, how are grassroots human rights defenders organizing and responding to confront these threats?
Okay. Thank you for that, Diana. I will share with you at least 8 impacts of COVID-19 in our communities and in the Philippines. One, as nurturers and caregivers, women has the most impact of this COVID-19. It doubles and triples their roles in their homes. Young women and girls experience multiple burden like their mothers because young women and girls are perceived in the patriarchal society as extension of their mothers and must always help in the house. Second, LGBT-led families are not considered families, hence they are not qualified for government assistance. The reliefs given are not gender sensitive, no dignity packs for women or milk for babies, to name a few. It's always, the traditional rice, noodles, and canned goods, which you're, of course, lucky if you receive some. Third, the issues on mental health greatly affects the women, from caring for their children to constantly worrying where to find food, losing both their jobs if with a partner, or if the partner loses its job. The suicide rate also went high because of long isolation, depression, and separation from families and partners. Fourth, women fall into prostitution because of losing their jobs, and uniformed men like police and the military have taken advantage of their vulnerability to perpetrate additional violence and abuse against women. Examples are sex in exchange of enhanced community quarantine or the EZQ passes to pass the borders and checkpoints. Fifth, the rising cases of domestic violence. When VOW victims go out of their houses, they are confronted with the military, which makes it more intimidating for them to ask for help or get out of the house. Some women has also no means to call for help or no load or no mobile phones at all. So even if sometimes even if you can call, some hotlines are not working. The militarized response of the government makes it more difficult for GBV or the gender-based violence and VOW, violence against women victims, to seek help. Sometimes uniformed men and government officials are the perpetrators itself, making it harder for women to report and access justice. There is also a thin line between customary laws and legal laws in the IP communities in dealing with VOW cases in the IP communities, where customary laws has more weight than the legal laws. Sixth, also the rising cases of teenage pregnancy, rape, and incest among the youth became high. Justice for GBV and VOW victims is not accessible because local VOW officers are unavailable. In our area alone, there were 21 incest rape cases recorded for the past 7 months. That was January to July 2020, compared to the 6 cases recorded in the same period last 2019. Most of the perpetrators are biological fathers of the victims with 8 cases, 7 cases with uncles as suspects, 5 as cousins, and 1 for relative. Seventh, the military is fully in control and using excessive force in the areas for not wearing of mask, and imprisonment or fines are imposed to those who went beyond curfew, even if it's just a minute late. Other local government units imprisoned women and men in dog cage as punishment, which of course we immediately called out for their inhumane and barbaric act. To sum it up, here in the Philippines for the last month, for my 8th, we have 4.5 million Filipinos unemployed this pandemic. This is the data from December 2020. 7,000 or 7,999 as to be exact as of March 2021 is our daily COVID cases 1 year after the lockdown. You know, it's like a sale, COVID sale, 7,999. We have also 134 human rights defenders killed from 2016 to 2019, and we have 61 lawyers killed under Duarte, and 27,000 and counting killed on his nonsensical war on drugs, even with this, even with the pandemic. So there, Diana.
And Jade, did you also want to share some of the examples of the community organizing and youth leadership in terms of, what have been grassroots organizers doing to confront these threats?
Oh, okay. For that, of course, the youth play a leader. The youths play a leadership and vital role in preventing violence and helping innovate new peace building technologies. Youth have creative ideas of how to overcome the challenges of lockdown, or at least are skilled with technology and social media and can strengthen the online and offline capacity of the population. It also helps to normalize the perception that youths are positive forces for peace and not threats to it. Even when a lot of youth have not known life without conflict, young people have clear visions of what peace should be and have a strong desire for a future without violence. We are the next to inherit the earth, its problems and current state, unfortunately. So might as well we have to educate, organize, and mobilize the youth, for we are the future. And of course, for the next generation to have a better, if not the best life, we lay the foundation for them to harvest the fruitful future. Thank you, Diana.
All right, thank you very much for that, Jade. And now I'd like to turn to our final speaker. Haidy Duque is a founding member and the Psychosocial Projects Coordinator at Vida, which provides critical services for Afro-Colombian and Indigenous women and youth recovering from war. Vida uses art and activism to provide healing for survivors of wartime violence in Colombia, including youth. So Haidy, my first question for you, in Colombia, what has been the impact of the pandemic on women, girls, and Afro-descendant and Indigenous communities, and how has the government responded to that? I'm also wondering, how does that intersect with the situation of ongoing conflict in the country? Please, Haidy.
Muchas gracias, Diana. Un saludo para cada una de las compañeras que hacen parte de este panel de hoy. Realmente da cuenta del trabajo que a nivel del mundo estamos haciendo las mujeres. Desde Colombia les mandamos un abrazo grande de solidaridad y queremos contar un poco nuestro contexto, que definitivamente es difícil de comprender en otros países, pero también es difícil de explicar porque son muchas los actores que hacen parte de este conflicto. Y sobre todo cuando a nivel del mundo se sabe que Colombia estamos en posconflicto, que se firmó un acuerdo de paz entre actores armados, pero inclusive a partir de eso seguimos viviendo el rigor de la guerra. Colombia es un país de regiones, multicultural, donde hay distintos grupos étnicos, originarios, indígenas, afrocolombianos, con particularidades en cada región. Lo que pasa en la zona rural es distinta a lo que pasa en la zona urbana y venimos de un proceso de guerra y de violencia de muchos años que ha calado también en nuestra psiquis, que ha calado también en nuestra manera de relacionarnos y que tiene que ver también con el trabajo que nosotros hacemos. En ese sentido, el COVID para nosotros se le suma a toda esa situación que ya tenemos y las más alejadas, donde no ha habido históricamente presencia del Estado, llega, digamos, el virus y hay una situación de no control de la situación y además la intervención del Estado sobre todo es una mayor militarización para el control, donde no ha tenido presencia en términos de salud, lo hace, la presencia es a nivel militar. Entonces, hemos vivido una militarización fuerte en el marco del COVID como manera de control. Seguimos teniendo asesinatos de líderes sociales. Estamos hablando que desde el año pasado a esta fecha, desde que iniciamos todo este proceso también de posconflicto, de firma de la paz, son más de 300 líderes sociales los que han sido asesinados. En los pueblos indígenas hablamos de un número importante de víctimas a nivel nacional. En todo este proceso son 9 millones de víctimas que están pidiendo justicia, que están pidiendo la verdad, que estamos pidiendo la no repetición. Por otro lado, la situación de feminicidio es muy alta y todavía en el marco del COVID, del confinamiento, se ha, digamos, aumentado significativamente. Hablamos de 558 casos de feminicidio de lo que va corrido el COVID desde el año pasado y solamente este año han sucedido 27, de enero a la fecha, 27 feminicidios que realmente cobra mucha importancia. Lo otro que quisiera resaltar en este, digamos, colocar el contexto de nuestro país, tiene que ver con las comunidades indígenas. Tenemos 87 pueblos indígenas, 87 pueblos originarios, que significa 60 lenguas, 64 lenguas distintas. Ese es un legado cultural importante para nuestro país, pero que está siendo exterminado por la violencia, por el abandono del Estado y ahora por el COVID. De esos pueblos inclusive hay una protección especial que la Corte Constitucional, por el riesgo que tienen, y ya preciso de más de 32 pueblos de ser extintos. Lo otro que vemos nosotros en el marco del COVID y este fuerte confinamiento que nos tocó, sobre todo el año pasado, tuvo que ver con la no posibilidad de ingreso para muchas familias, porque la mayoría de las poblaciones que han sido víctimas trabajan del día a día, su trabajo es informal y eso significa salir como decimos los colombianos, al rebusque, a vender, a llevar las artesanías afuera, buscando clientes y eso no se podía hacer. Entonces, familias que no tenían para pagar arriendo, para la sobrevivencia, y dentro de ese número, digamos, importante, mayor número son mujeres tratando de buscar la sobrevivencia de su familia. Ahí, digamos que eso ha sido frente a un Estado, frente a un gobierno que hace un performance todos los días en televisión de presentar noticias que tienen que ver con el COVID, pero no atendiendo ni los problemas ya endémicos, los problemas crónicos que tenemos en el país y solamente eclipsando la realidad a través de la televisión. En un descuido total de lo que significa digamos, la salud como un derecho y la paz también como un derecho.
Thank you very much for that, Heidi. And I see how, you know, as you were referring to in this difficult circumstance where we're seeing, you know, these militarized responses, as we're seeing human rights defenders and activists who are being increasingly attacked. I think that was something that, you know, what you said had in common with what, you know, Jade was just describing. In a context where there's, you know, not enough government response or protection for marginalized communities under the pandemic, what do you see as some of the key strategies that women leaders and activists are using to confront both the conflict and the pandemic?
Yo creo que es importante resaltar el papel que juegan, que hemos jugado las mujeres de manera organizada. Yo creo que ha sido la respuesta de vida que hemos tenido en este país, los procesos organizativos de las mujeres, donde los jóvenes han jugado un papel significativo. Y con gran emoción veíamos que en medio de toda esta pandemia, cuando se inició las 2 primeras semanas que a todos nos aterrorizó la situación de la pandemia y no sabíamos qué hacer, fueron realmente las organizaciones de mujeres, las organizaciones de comunidades étnicas y los jóvenes los que empezaron a generar acciones de salvaguarda de la vida. Y fue algo significativo también el rescatar curas tradicionales para hacer frente a todo lo de la pandemia, frente al abandono del Estado, y en eso empezamos a tomar actitudes de sobrevivientes también, de personas que saben entender el contexto, reaccionar rápido por la experiencia que ya se tiene de otras crisis, de otras situaciones complejas que se ha tocado enfrentar y sobrevivir. Yo creo que la misma intuición que tenemos como mujeres de cuidado de la vida hizo que, digamos, se generara una reacción rápida. Y esto llevó a que el Estado, a que el gobierno se sintiera presionado a responder. Porque una cosa son las situaciones que en Colombia se dan en Bogotá como capital, pero otra las que vemos en las regiones. Y hay regiones, digamos, en contextos muy preocupantes, donde está la presencia del narcotráfico, que es la que controla todo, hasta los medicamentos y la comida, como Cauca, Nariño, Chocó, Antioquia, Valle del Cauca, donde, digamos, el mayor número de víctimas son mujeres. Y la situación que, digamos, de sinergia que se dio entre las mujeres y los jóvenes que conocían de la tecnología y las mujeres que conocían de la parte de tradiciones. Entonces, creo que ahí eso ayudó a resolver mucho de las situaciones de la misma enfermedad. Por otro lado, el trabajo psicosocial y en particular todo lo que viene haciendo Taller de Vida como Ashaja, de que los niños confinados, con todo lo que eso ha significado como la pandemia y la agresión, digamos, psíquica, el hecho de escribir cuentos, de conectarse, de generar redes, de no sentirnos solos, de generar círculos de la palabra, círculos de conversación entre nosotras, involucrando a los niños y a toda la comunidad. Digamos que son acciones que ayudaron de manera significativa a generar esos vínculos y la salud mental necesaria para hacer frente a toda esta situación, porque tampoco tenían acceso a la parte de educación.
Thank you very much for that, Heidi. And you know, I think that as we're about to transition into the Q&A section where we'll be able to open it up for the audience. And so please do, folks who are attending, if you have questions, please do add them into the chat. I'm struck by, as I'm listening to you three sharing your analysis and from your context, all of the many similarities between, even though Yemen is obviously very different from the Philippines, is very different from Colombia, there are certain aspects that are really presenting as sort of very similar. And one thing that I noted is the key role of grassroots women and youth organizers as first responders to be able to provide urgent care in contexts where governments are either unable or unwilling to do that. Heidi, you were just saying sort of the rapid response capacity that has been built up over the years. You were able to use that in this context. The other thing that I noted as an unfortunate comparison between your presentations is when the government actually is hostile towards the kinds of activism that is needed to defend communities, hostile and violent against those people who are leading that kind of vital social work. So, thank you again for sharing those experiences and that analysis. Again, if you have, those of you who are attending, we can't see you, but we would love for you to be part of this conversation. So please do add your questions into the chat here. And maybe I can actually kick off with a question that is spins off a little bit from what I was just saying. As you, Heidi, Jade, and Muna, as you were all just listening to each other, was there anything that jumped out at you as a similarity from your experience to what the other two were also sharing? I wonder if anything like that was striking to you. And please just feel free to jump in. Anyone who likes. Muna, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just, I think everything struck me, but one of the things is what Heidi was saying about the difference in culture, dialect, language. These are so many challenges that really only the women think of and start to respond to. And I think that when we say that we need women at the table, it's not as one of the ministers said, oh, you just want a good salary and to be a minister. No, it's not that way. It's because women bring a different reflection to the table. They bring in that culture aspect. They bring in the prevention of youth joining battlefields. They bring in the other aspects that are not not shared in this. So I was really struck by 64, I think, languages that you were saying. Imagine, having to create awareness with all of that differences, and and all that Jade was saying about the difficulties and challenges of the policing environment, which is so scary. And I also have a question: is how do you deal with that on your, as a peace builder? How do you protect yourself so that you can protect others? Thank you.
May I answer, Diana?
Yes, please, Jade, go ahead.
Thank you for that, Muna. Well, to answer your question, we're doing actually a security audit, and everything from both digital, online and offline. We're having security trainings as well to at least help us and our communities, because who will respond to this if if not us, or if we're gone, something like that. And part of your sharing as well that I was struck was the issue on water. So just imagine, it may sound simple, like water, but just imagine that in these pandemic times and you have no safe water. Oh my God, like that really blew my mind, because even without the pandemic, having no water or having no access of water is is so difficult. So I could only imagine in conflict areas like Yemen, in the refugee camps, or so having no water or at least safe water. That's really and that's essential to us. Actually, both men, women, children. So there and today is World Water Day, as you mentioned. I actually realized that now. Thank you for that too, and congratulations because for the ceasefire in Yemen that you just announced today.
Mhm. Thank you. Heidi, is there anything that you would like to reflect on that you found was either similar or different to your experience from what Jade and Muna were sharing?
Muchas gracias. Realmente estoy muy conmovida de escuchar cada una de esas referencias de cada uno de los países porque nos sentimos muy conectados en eso y sobre todo en tema, yo creo, también por mi tradición espiritual, en la resonancia energética que estamos haciendo nosotros en el mundo. Yo creo que estamos llamados a potenciar más eso, no podemos echar para atrás. Este hecho de conectarnos hoy y de generar sensibilidad de cada una de las experiencias de los países, yo creo que es poderosa para los que nos están viendo, para los que luego van a ver este video, para cada uno de los personas con las que ustedes están, tiene que ver con una resonancia energética que también necesita nuestra humanidad y tiene que ver con humanizarnos. Eso mismo pasa en nuestro país, porque los que están en la ciudad, hay gente que está bien y les importa 5, oyen las noticias y no se conmueven. Y yo creo que el trabajo tiene que ir también dirigido a eso, a generar más humanidad. Y yo creo que es lo que están haciendo ustedes, lo que sucede con un evento como esto y la participación de nosotras, de las mujeres, de los jóvenes, de los niños, está orientada a eso, a generar más humanidad y creo que estamos llamados en el mundo a eso. Y en eso me uno con cada una de las historias y lo que ustedes acaban de decir de las experiencias en cada país y de lo que estamos haciendo con MADRE. El unirnos en esa resonancia de mirar al otro desde el ser humano que es y desde la no violencia. Así como la violencia es contagiosa, creo que el amor y la posibilidad de respeto también tiene que ser todavía mucho más contagiosa.
Thank you for that, Heidi, and also reminding us about how important it is for us to make these interpersonal relationships and human connections, even though we are, on Zoom and very far away from each other. So I see that there is a question in the chat here, specifically about the marginalization and vulnerability of trans women. And a few people brought up how gender-based violence, how domestic violence has surged in the context of the pandemic and amidst the lockdowns. So the question was, how can we ensure that that there is inclusion for trans women in our response, and especially in places where they're marginalized and not recognized. So I wonder, if any of the panelists would like to address that one. I think Jade in particular, you mentioned, or Heidi. Heidi, go ahead.
Quisiera decir algo que comentaban algunas mujeres trans ahora que conversaba tratando de preparar este encuentro y ellas, o sea, eran mujeres peluqueras que se dedicaban a actividades de trabajo sencillos y no saben por qué las asesinaron, por qué las perseguían y generaban ese odio. Entonces, una de las cosas que ellos están diciendo, acá estamos en un proceso de conocer la verdad. Y yo creo que esa verdad, en el marco de la Comisión de la Verdad, que es una de las acciones importantes que están sucediendo en este momento en nuestro país a partir de lo que son los acuerdos de paz, la Comisión de la Verdad ha hecho visible esa voz que nadie las escuchaba. Entonces creo que lo primero tiene que ver con hacer visible esa voz a esos seres humanos que fueron maltratados por puro odio, por todos los actores armados del país, paramilitares, militares, guerrilla también. Entonces quieren saber por qué. Y es parte de la pregunta que están haciendo y que desde la Comisión de la Verdad, y creo que la inclusión digamos, de sus voces, la inclusión de sus historias, hacerlas públicas, ya es un primer paso importante.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you for that. There's also a question in the chat specifically about the Women, Peace and Security agenda and the degree to which that has or perhaps has not been helpful in, putting pressure on governments to include women in peace processes and in provision of services in post-conflict situations. So, I wonder if anyone on the panel would be interested to address, is it increasing a sense of international pressure or a feeling of obligation on the part of national leaders to pay attention to women, peace, and security?
Yeah, I can take that, Diana, in a way. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda, or the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, has been a great help, assisting, guiding us, and I think it's the only thing we really have in our hands to hold them by. But the issue with 1325 is it doesn't really have any mechanisms to pressure warring parties or the governments. It should have. I think it's just not utilizing them. It's not effective enough. For instance, for Yemen, the peace process is led by the UN. In 2012, we had a national dialogue. We had already achieved so much as women during the Arab Spring. And then during the national dialogue, the women had already achieved a 30% quota. And they were already really participating in the government. They were in leading roles in the peace process. Unfortunately, the warring parties and the UN has taken us back 10 years backwards. And it's because they have left it up to the warring parties to choose if they want the women or not. So in Kuwait, we had a few women, and then it went down again. And then in Stockholm, we only had one woman. And then in Geneva, there was still also only one woman. Imagine only one woman in all of the delegations. And she was there, not because they had chosen her, but because she was an assistant to one of the political parties. So they had to choose somebody because she was the only one there. So it wasn't really somebody, it wasn't their choice. None of the member states pushed for women participation. And that was really frustrating and shocking for us as women. So in Geneva too, what we did is we claimed our space. We just went without invitation. We went to Geneva, a delegation of 4 women, and we met with all the member states who were there, the politicians, the government, the UN envoy, and we made our own delegation. But this is really not effective because after that, in the Stockholm Agreement, they took the delegations and put them in this really remote island where we couldn't get there. And it was shocking for us because these are feminist foreign policies that we really thought would pressure. So I think that the 1325, the resolution, the agenda after 20 years, I think it's still very disappointing. Women are still not in the peace processes in Afghanistan, everywhere. Syria, we're always in the consultation line, but we don't want to be only consulted and sidelined. We need to be in the delegations that's where the decisions are being made that affect 30 million people. And women don't only bring women's issues, they bring in the reflection of the whole community and society. So I think there's more to be done there. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Jade, go ahead, please.
Sorry. May I speak, Diana?
Yes, please.
Okay, regarding your sharing, thank you for that sharing, Muna. And I actually want to add something on that. Being in solidarity with the international community helps strengthen the fight. and promote peace building among sectoral movements. And young people should be involved in the design of any response to conflict.
Mhm.
That's all.
Mhm. Yes, thank you for that.
Yo quisiera agregar también, me sumo a lo que dicen ya nuestras dos panelistas, Mona y James, en el sentido de que las mujeres somos constructoras de paz. Y en esa construcción de paz que la hacemos en el día a día, desde la construcción además de ir tejiendo en pequeñito e ir soñando en grande, poco a poco, cosa que hace que sea sostenible, digamos, esa posibilidad. Pediría yo también a Naciones Unidas, uno, que haga una mirada especial en los países que estamos en medio del conflicto armado y que estamos las mujeres y los jóvenes, los niños, mujeres jóvenes trabajando en esto, uno, que se garantice la seguridad de las mujeres y por el otro, que se les reconozca a nivel internacional como constructoras de paz y que eso signifique también en el marco de nuestros países, de algún modo, un escudo de protección. Parece importante que se valore el trabajo como constructoras de paz que hacemos las mujeres en el mundo.
Thank you for that. You know, it also really strikes me that, you know, Muna was speaking to some of the difficulties that that women, civil society leaders experience in being able to shape the agenda. And I think that, you know, that comes in large part because there is an understanding that when women are at the table, that transformation happens. When women and youth and civil society are at the table that represent and that are connected to local communities, it cannot be business as usual. You have to go back to root causes and create policies and agreements that will lead to true transformation. And I think that there is a sense that that people, you know, are trying to stop that from happening in a lot of instances. So, so really speaks to the strength of your work. It seems like we might have lost Heidi, but hopefully she'll be able to rejoin us. I saw there was another question in the chat, and please, folks who are attending, please do continue to share your questions. This is really great, and really glad to be able to pose them to the panelists. There was one question a few moments ago around the right to information, and access to justice during the pandemic. I wonder if either Muna or Jade, and you know, perhaps if Heidi's able to rejoin us, can speak to, you know, access to information as a challenge, perhaps, or as something that you've been able to overcome in your circumstance. I don't know if I know Jade, you were. Muna,
we
go
don't,
ahead.
we don't, it's just, you know, I'm sorry, but it's just, we don't have access to information. And when we do, it's always inaccurate information and misleading. And that's actually one of the problems that we faced during COVID-19. And now it's resurfacing again. It's because of all the misconceptions, misinformation that was spread by the government and by the de facto Houthis also. So I think we rely a lot on the youth on the ground, and the women for real information, but from official sources, yeah, it's a total disaster.
Okay. Well, for us, in our work, of course, the continuous information education drive, especially to women and IPs, to have IPs, indigenous peoples, to have access to such information on health and making sure that recovery plans are just, gender, IP, and PW sensitive. The pandemic has shown and highlighted the barriers in terms of information, access to services, and justice. It also highlighted the class or the economic status and racial divide among the people, and now the digital divide. It is especially important that this information is being provided to other women, since women are often the primary caregivers in their homes and provide the majority of formal and informal healthcare. For example, one instance also is the information about vaccines, because here in the Philippines, Duterte is really best friends and close to communist China. And their vaccine, Sinovac, it's a bit, the vaccines are is a debate here for us, because for one, Sinovac hasn't released any transparency on their data for their testings and such, but our administration is really pushing for Sinovac, so that's one. And a lot of fake news about the pandemic is also one, and we're really trying to combat that as well. Fake news against health, about the healthcare crisis, about the deaths, the recoveries. You know, they're trying to add up numbers. You know, a while ago when I mentioned the 7,999, and I told you that it's like, you know, it's like a COVID sale, it's like a psychological sale, 7,999, but in the actual it's like 8,000 and plus and more. So they tend to manipulate the numbers just for the people to, you know, be you know, to be psyched up that it's either we're just getting 7,999, so that's okay. It's not even 9,000 or 10,000. They're not releasing the real data. So of course that's also a problem. And you know, misinformation can lead you to a lot of things that could really happen when you're misinformed. Sorry.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly the question of misinformation in the context of this pandemic is something we've experienced in so many places all over the world, including, you know, right here in the US where I'm calling from. And what it reminds me of is again the invaluable role of community leadership and trusted leadership, where people feel like if there's somebody who is sharing information that's vetted and that, you know, they have become to rely on that person or that organization in their community to meet their needs and to take care of them, then, you know, the role that, you know, Muna and Jade and you know, Haidy and others are able to play in ensuring accurate information is all the more important. We did get a little note that Haidy is having a tech problem. Again, I hope she'll be able to join us. Oh, and I think she might be joining us in just a moment.
Yeah.
So, you know, well, just riffing off of the last point we were making, you know, as we're entering into this next phase of pandemic response, we're hearing a lot of news about vaccine distribution, but also where places are being left behind and not receiving the vaccine. You know, we wondered, you know, how are you as peace builders, as grassroots organizations, envisioning a role in how you might be able to ensure equitable distribution and access to vaccine and that kind of care in the future, including for marginalized communities like Afro-descended people, indigenous groups, women and girls, people with disabilities, and more who may otherwise be left behind. Wonder if any on the panel have thoughts about that question.
Okay. May I answer, Diana?
Yes, please, Jade.
Okay. Well, for your question, it's a good one. Grassroots women organizations play a very big role in the process and must be included and not excluded in the process. For instance, local and grassroots organizations are tapped to assist in the rollout of vaccines. Grassroots organizations have been working in providing access to information on healthcare, humanitarian aid, and social services. As women peace builders can join the information drives to lessen the vaccine hesitancy in the community. But in our case here in the Philippines, our government's priority is far from what the World Health Organization's mandate to prioritize the frontliners and healthcare workers first. Instead, Duterte prioritized the security forces instead of healthcare workers. They even vaccinated the security force in secret, while the starving people are dying and waiting for a vaccine to be rolled out and for mass testing.
Mhm.
There.
Thank you, Jade.
En el caso, ¿puedo responder? En el caso de Colombia, el manejo de las vacunas ha estado centralizado totalmente en el gobierno nacional. Casi no hay ni siquiera influencia de los gobiernos locales. Y desde ahí se envían las vacunas que hay que colocar. La promesa que se ha hecho a nivel público del número de vacunas no se ha cumplido. Nosotros en lo que deberíamos ir a esta fecha ni siquiera vamos por el 20% de las vacunas colocadas. Por otro lado, es evidente la corrupción en el país en el manejo de las vacunas. Se han perdido vacunas, hay vacunas que no se le colocan a las personas que deberían colocárselos, digamos, por el plan de vacunación, por la edad, sino que se están negociando aparte por ciertos grupos mafiosos que se han, digamos, apoderado de vacunas en las mismas regiones. Entonces, realmente hay expectativa, pero también desesperanza en que sea pronto, digamos, la vacuna en los sectores populares, las comunidades indígenas. Lo que se está haciendo las personas es tratar de recuperar muchos de los medicina tradicional, digamos, para soportar esta pandemia, y dicen que no es primera vez que estamos enfrentando un virus de esta naturaleza. Entonces, como tomando esa sabiduría popular para resistir a la situación, que vemos lejos que las vacunas lleguen hasta nuestros sectores y a la población con la que estamos.
Mm. Mm. Okay. One other question that we wanted to share, we've heard from a few of you that the ways that the COVID pandemic has been used as a cover or a justification for harmful government actions that can further oppress communities or neglect their needs. Do you have any thoughts about strategies? How can we guard against these harmful manipulations of the pandemic? And what do you think policymakers in your context or more broadly should be doing differently?
Okay. May I answer your question,
Yes.
Lena?
Yes, Jade, please.
Okay. For your question, actually, it's a good one, because what must the government do? So the COVID-19 is a pandemic. So governments should treat it as a public health emergency and not a peace and order problem. So like here in the Philippines, retired generals and military people are the ones in charge of vaccines and vaccine negotiation, and not health experts. Same with the appointed people in the IATF, or the IATF is the Interagency Task Force on Emerging Infectious Diseases here in the Philippines. So they are governed by, it is a task force organized by the executive of the Philippine government to respond to affairs concerning emerging infectious diseases in the Philippines, but it is managed by the military people, so the PNP and the AFP, and again, it's not the health experts. So because of this militaristic and authoritative kind of response, it enables an atmosphere that reinforces impunity, lack of accountability in the security forces. It reinforces partisan leadership in the rollout of aid and resources to benefit the public, like politicking in the aid. The lack of transparency in the resources, of course, leads to corruption and graft. That's why since 2020, this pandemic, for the majority of the politicians, serves to strengthen their position and weaken the position of their opponent, especially now because our national elections is near on 2022. So there. And the inefficient policies that deprives the people of services but enables politicking and corruption is another matter when the treatment or response to a public health crisis is an authoritarian response. So back to you, Diana.
Thank you very much, Jade. Muna or Heidi, do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I just want to say it's really difficult for Yemen because Yemen is one of the countries that everything has been weaponized, everything, food, water, fuel recently, for a long time, but recently it's been a much more a bigger crisis. And now we have shipments in the sea, in the open sea, that have been there for months. The private sector is shutting down their factories. That means that no more food commodities will be there. So everything has been used, and COVID-19 is no exception. I'm sure that the vaccine will also be monopolized by multiple groups. The International Humanitarian Organization favors some areas to other areas, which is really also an issue. We've had, like I said at the beginning, billions and billions coming into Yemen. Everybody's saying, where is the money? Why are people starving if there's so much coming in? When we started the COVID-19, the response of the WHO was very slow. They only really reacted when the private sector, such as the HSA group and others, started really taking up this initiative and providing tons of aid and PPE materials and oxygen ventilators and all of that for Yemen. It's been really disappointing, and I don't think the vaccine is going to be an exception. I hope not. I hope I'm wrong. But if there is no real pressure by the international community and especially by the US, the UK, the 5P, these are the ones who are leading the peace process in Yemen. And they are separating the humanitarian crisis from the peace process, and that's wrong. The economy, the humanitarian crisis are also contributing to the violence. They are drivers of the famine. So it's not enough to say we have malnutrition children in Yemen. We also have to say why there is obstruction of aid and obstruction of medicine in Yemen. So I think this is really important to start thinking of a national strategy where all the parties are working together to combat COVID-19. None of the parties can do this on their own. They're all exploiting it. In the north with the Houthis, they've also taken, like Jade said, a militarized approach where the generals and military are the ones who are leading this, and the government for many years has been in exile, and even when they are in Yemen, this is not part of their real priority. Until recently, they've even said, the Yemeni people should take care of themselves. So there's no real strategy. So we should do what we should do, but the government is not going to do anything for us. It's a very sad situation, but it's also threatening because any threat in Yemen will not only stay in Yemen, it will also be behind the walls of Yemen. That's why we have called for also the release of prisoners, the release of detainees, because these are really time bombs ticking bombs, which can be really a big threat. So for Yemen, we need a coherent, coordinated humanitarian response. We need restructuring of the humanitarian programs in Yemen, and we need the donors to also put pressure on the organizations in Yemen to support also the local NGOs in Yemen, because during COVID-19, it was really the locals who were on the ground. We're not saying that we can do this on our own. We're not saying that the international community should do this on their own. There has to be coordination, and it has to be a unified strategy. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you. Heidi, did you also
En el caso nuestro.
Go ahead, Heidi, please.
En el caso de Colombia vemos por un lado la restricción de derechos como la libertad, la no garantía de un derecho fundamental como es la salud, la educación y la alimentación, y también la posibilidad de un trabajo digno. algo de lo que estábamos reclamando a nivel de las organizaciones sociales es un ingreso básico para las familias, y esto no se ha dado a nivel del gobierno y no pasó, digamos, como legislación en el Congreso. Lo que sí está pasando en el Congreso es que están aprovechando esta situación también para introducir unos cambios a nivel legal que tienen que ver con nuevos impuestos, con nuevas restricciones, inclusive con cambio que tiene que ver con el tiempo de gobierno, que es de 4 años, y aprovechando toda esta situación, quieren colocarlo a 6 años para establecer, digamos, en el marco de esta polarización que tenemos, quedarse el gobierno por más tiempo. Entonces, pensamos que a nivel de restricción de derechos humanos hay un claro aprovechamiento de la situación que genera el COVID en la población para generar leyes que restringen todavía más las libertades y la garantía de derechos. Y eso nos preocupa.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you all very much for that. And
Diana, hay una situación que está pasando muy reciente aquí en Colombia, en una de las regiones, y es el asesinato de una abuela con su hija, un asesinato que tiene que ver por su labor como lideresa protectora de la naturaleza, y también por ser una de las mujeres, digamos, que era cuidadora de su comunidad. Ahora en el marco del COVID fue asesinada por actores armados, eh, por su liderazgo. Entonces me pedían varias de las compañeras acá en Colombia que hiciera mención de eso, como una manera de honrar su trabajo en este momento. Muchas gracias.
mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Heidi, for sharing that with all of us. And we're down to our last few moments together. And so I just want to pose one final question to all of our panelists here. Thinking again back to where we started about how we're all here at virtual CSW. You know, we're using the technology to be able to connect to each other across all of the distance. And thank you again to our participants who we feel your presence even though we can't see you in the Zoom room. But what would be, you know, one message that you would want to share with our colleagues here at CSW? What is one thing that you would like audience members to take away from this discussion, from what we've been going over here today? And I put it to all of you to, you know, to reflect on together. It's a hard question because I'm asking you to summarize an hour and a half of discussion that we've been having here together. But if, you know, if there's anything you'd like to share, Jade, please go ahead.
Okay, well, for me, for everybody that's here, of course, let us always continue the fight, even if sometimes it's hard. It's hard, it's dangerous. Let us continue to educate, to organize, and to mobilize. And of course, let us live, let us love, and let us struggle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jade. Muna or Heidi, anything you would like to share?
Yo quisiera, creo que tiene que ver con esa sororidad que se nota en este momento, y es la invitación a no desfallecer, a seguir haciendo nuestro trabajo, digamos, con alegría, con entusiasmo, con berraquera, como decimos acá en Colombia, y creo que eso no tiene traducción. Yo quisiera en este espacio honrar a todas las mujeres del mundo por la labor que hacen de cuidar la vida, y resaltar también a los jóvenes, a las y los jóvenes que vienen también asumiendo esta labor. Y agradecer a Madre por conectarnos a todas. Eso quisiera decir para finalizar. Muchas gracias y un abrazo a cada una de ustedes y a los que nos escuchen.
Thank you, Heidi. Muna, any last reflections from you?
Thank you for the beautiful thoughts. And I really want to also honor all the organizations that have been supporting us around the world, all the people, all the volunteers, everybody who has advocated to stop the war in Yemen and around the world. Those who have advocated fiercely and risked their lives to advocate for the stop of arms trade. These are real heroes. And I think that today and every day, we should honor, recognize, and support the contribution of women and youth, community leaders who provide life-saving support around the world. And I think this is the time for world leaders. This is the time for them to really listen, because a conflict in one area will affect any other area. We're not immune. We're not in a bubble on our own. The world is so universal. As you can see today, our suffering is very similar, and we all need to act upon that. So thank you so much for everybody who has joined us today and who has supported us behind the scenes for the many years. And I hope that although we've seen a lot of suffering, I just wanted to say that there are also a lot of good people out there who are doing a lot of good work. And I'm sure that we will reach peace. And thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mona. And what a beautiful note that you all shared to end this conversation on. And I'd like to thank all of you all for joining this discussion, and thank our speakers very much for sharing their insights today. And again, if you would like to receive the recording link and just to stay in touch with us moving forward, there was a sign-up link that was shared in the chat a few moments ago. Please do share your contact information and we'll be sure to follow up with you. And thank you all very much once again, and have a good rest of your day and CSW.